Today I'm going to be sharing 3 tips with you for making your patterns as concise as possible. And while this is geared towards print patterns, it's certainly applicable for digital patterns as well. And it's just good practice overall. So even if you're not writing print patterns, you will hopefully find some of these tips helpful. Tip number 1 is to put dimensions on the figure rather than in the text. Now, dimensions are really, really important because a lot of people are going to want to check and make sure that they've sewn everything correctly as they go. So if you're not putting dimensions in your quilt patterns for each unit, subunit, and block assembly, start doing that. That's really important. But instead of putting them into the text, just put it on the figure itself. So a typical quilt pattern, you might say, lay out and assemble your pieces to form a finished block. It will have dimensions of 15.5 by 15.5 inches. Which is totally fine, but that it will have dimensions of 15.5 by 15.5 inches. If you're doing that with every single step and subunit, will really add up in terms of space on the page. So a better way to do it is instead of stating the dimensions, just put them on the figure themselves. Just taking it out of the text not only makes the text more readable, but it'll shorten up your pattern because you're just going to show it on the figure instead. Tip number 2 is to indicate the pressing direction on the diagram as well, instead of stating it in the text. So the easiest way to do this is to just put arrows on your diagrams and state in the before you begin section that all pressing directions are indicated with arrows. Now, if your pressing seams open, it's even easier because you can just leave these arrows off and just say all seams are pressed open. And then within the pattern, you don't even have to repeat that. You don't need to say press seams open at every single step. But if you prefer to press your seams to the side, you have to include those pressing directions with each step. And that can really consume a lot of your real estate if you have to write it out at each step. So by stating, hey, pressing directions are indicated with arrows throughout the pattern, follow the gold arrows or follow the red arrows, depending on the coloring in your pattern. It makes it really easy to kind of see visually where the seams are going, which direction you're pressing them, and also removes all of that extra text that indicates the pressing direction. So this is a really good way to do it. Now, a note about colors. You kind of have to pick the color of your pressing arrows depending on the coloring in your pattern diagrams. It's not just a one size fits all. So typically I will go with a red arrow, but red on pink in this particular example is going to be a no-go. That does not work at all. So I've changed these arrows to gold. They're a little bit easier to see, but you kind of have to pick the color of those arrows depending on what color your diagrams are. What you don't want to do is make the arrows black if you have black arrows kind of showing panels of your diagram like I do here. If I have more arrows that are black arrows showing pressing direction, it's going to be really difficult for someone to see what is a pressing arrow and what's just kind of the transformation of the quilt pieces. So you need to color them something different. It's really important to make that distinction, but you need to just pick a color that works with the scheme in your quilt pattern. Purple, blue, green tends to stand out really well unless you're working with lots of greens. Whatever's going to have the most contrast, that's the color you want to use for those pressing arrows. The third tip I have for you is to use as shown to your advantage. So instead of trying to verbally describe every single step of the quilt block and how these pieces are coming together, you're just going to reference the figure diagram with an as shown. So instead of saying attach a corner unit to the left side of a center unit with all of the points pointing towards the center, you can just say layout and attach as shown. And then you look at the diagram and they know exactly what direction they're supposed to go. That's going to alleviate a lot of text that you would otherwise have to add. Now, there is kind of a caveat here, and that has to do with accessibility. So if you have someone who's disabled or visually impaired in some way and they're using a screen reader, that's part of why you describe everything in the text and not just rely on the figure. But there are ways to get around that, especially with digital patterns, because you can put alternate text for those images that a screen reader or some sort of assistive device for visually impaired individuals will pick up and be able to kind of read out to them in place of the diagram that your non-impaired customers will not see because they don't need that part of it. It's just in the alt text on the image. So there's ways to get around this, and I would suggest using those rather than just trying to catch all with one pattern, because putting all of that extra text in there for the vast majority of your customers is going to be incredibly painful to read, and it's going to take up a ton of room. So leave it out, use your figures to your advantage. If you want to make your patterns more adaptable, use the alt text to your advantage. That's going to be the best option for you. At the end of the day, quilters are very, very visual people. And so they're going to end up looking at the figures more than they look at your text anyways. So why not use that to your advantage and just remove a lot of this excess text that nobody's ultimately going to read anyways. Alrighty. That's all I've got for you today. If you like this and found it helpful, please make sure you subscribe to my channel so you don't miss next week's episode of Tech Tip Tuesday. See ya!